Imagine a man whose scientific breakthrough saves billions of lives by solving world hunger. Now imagine that same man standing on a battlefield, personally overseeing the release of poison gas that chokes soldiers to death in their trenches. A Nobel Prize winner who made it possible to feed the world's growing population, and also the father of chemical warfare who unleashed horrors that still haunt us today. This is Fritz Haber, perhaps the most morally complex figure in modern science. His discovery of how to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen in the air revolutionized agriculture and prevented mass starvation. That same process provided the nitrogen for explosives that prolonged World War I and killed millions. He then weaponized chemistry itself, creating chlorine gas attacks that introduced a new dimension of horror to warfare. We're exploring one of history's most troubling examples of science's dual nature, how the same knowledge can save lives and destroy them, how brilliant minds can produce both miracles and nightmares. This is the story of a Jewish scientist so devoted to Germany that he converted religions and served his country fanatically, only to be betrayed by the Nazi regime he had helped create. A man whose wife, also a chemist, killed herself in despair over his weapons work. A genius whose legacy is so contradictory that half the nitrogen in your body probably came from his process, while his chemical weapons innovations killed and maimed hundreds of thousands. Let's explore the brilliant, tragic, morally compromised life of Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber was born on December 9, 1868, in Breslau, Prussia, now Rockall, Poland, into a prosperous Jewish merchant family. His mother died in childbirth, leaving his father Siegfried to raise him. The relationship between father and son was difficult. Siegfried wanted Fritz to join the family chemical business, while Fritz dreamed of becoming a scientist. This tension would define much of Haber's early life. Haber grew up during a period when German Jews were attempting to assimilate into mainstream German society. The Enlightenment had brought legal emancipations, allowing Jews to enter professions previously closed to them. Many German Jews embraced German culture enthusiastically, viewing themselves as Germans of Jewish faith rather than as a separate ethnic group. Haber absorbed this assimilationist worldview completely. He was German first, Jewish only by ancestry. He studied chemistry at several German universities, receiving his doctorate from the University of Berlin in 1891. His early career was undistinguished. He worked briefly in his father's business, then held various academic positions without making significant breakthroughs. He was ambitious, brilliant, but hadn't yet found the problem that would make his reputation. In 1901, Haber converted from Judaism to Christianity, specifically to Lutheranism. The conversion was pragmatic rather than spiritual. Conversion improved career prospects and social acceptance in Imperial Germany. Academic positions at prestigious universities were effectively closed to Jews, regardless of ability. By converting, Haber opened doors that would otherwise remain shut. He was hardly alone. Many ambitious German Jews converted for similar reasons, choosing career advancement over religious identity. That same year, Haber married Clara Immerwahr, a remarkable woman who was one of the first women to earn a doctorate in chemistry in Germany. Clara was brilliant, idealistic, and committed to using science for human betterment. She had overcome enormous obstacles to become a chemist in an era when women were actively discouraged from scientific careers. Her marriage to Fritz initially seemed a partnership of equals, two brilliant chemists working together. It would end in tragedy. If you're fascinated by this exploration of science's moral complexity, please subscribe to our channel. We examine history's most complicated figures, those who don't fit neatly into hero or villain categories, bringing you stories that challenge simple moral judgments. By the early 20th century, scientists understood a looming crisis. The world's population was growing rapidly, but agricultural productivity couldn't keep pace. The limiting factor was nitrogen. Plants need nitrogen to grow, but atmospheric nitrogen, which makes up 78% of air, is inert. Plants can't use it directly. They need nitrogen in reactive forms like ammonia or nitrates. Natural nitrogen fixation occurred through lightning strikes and certain bacteria in plant roots, but these sources couldn't supply enough nitrogen for expanding agriculture. The primary nitrogen source for fertilizer was guano, bird droppings, and Chilean saltpeter, natural nitrate deposits, both limited resources being rapidly depleted. Scientists predicted that without new nitrogen sources, mass starvation would begin by mid-century as food production couldn't match population growth. Fritz Haber attacked this problem with obsessive determination. Working at the University of Karlsruhe, he experimented with ways to synthesize ammonia directly from atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen. The challenge was enormous. Nitrogen is extraordinarily stable and resists reacting. Previous attempts had failed or produced ammonia so inefficiently as to be commercially useless. In 1909, after years of work, Haber succeeded. Using high pressure, high temperature, and an iron catalyst, he demonstrated a process that could convert nitrogen from the air into ammonia efficiently. It was one of chemistry's greatest achievements, solving a problem that had defeated the world's best scientists. The Haber process, as it became known, made nitrogen fertilizer abundant and affordable. The industrial implementation was perfected by Carl Bosch, a chemical engineer working for BASF. The Haber-Bosch process began commercial operation in 1913, just in time. World War I would soon begin, and the nitrogen it produced would prove crucial, but not in the way anyone expected. The impact of the Haber-Bosch process on human civilization cannot be overstated. It literally changed the equation of human survival. Estimates suggest that without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, only about 4 billion people could be sustained on Earth. The current population of over 8 billion is possible only because of Haber's invention. Roughly half the nitrogen in your body came not from natural sources but from the Haber-Bosch process. Haber didn't just feed millions, he made it possible for billions to exist. For this achievement, Haber received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. The award was controversial for reasons we'll explore, but the scientific achievement was undeniable. Haber had solved one of humanity's fundamental problems. He should have been celebrated as one of history's great benefactors, a scientist whose work saved more lives than perhaps any other single innovation. But there's another side to the story, one that would forever complicate Haber's legacy and transform him from savior into someone far more morally ambiguous. When World War I began in August 1914, Fritz Haber was 45 years old. At the height of his scientific powers and intensely patriotic, like many Germans, he believed Germany was fighting a defensive war against encircling enemies. He wanted to serve his country, to use his scientific knowledge for the war effort. The German military was happy to accept his services. Germany faced a critical strategic problem. The British naval blockade cut off imports of chili and saltpeter, essential for producing explosives. Without nitrates, Germany couldn't manufacture munitions. The war would be over in months as ammunition ran out. But Haber's ammonia synthesis process solved this crisis. The same nitrogen fixation that produced fertilizer could be adapted to produce nitrates for explosives. Germany could now manufacture unlimited munitions using only air, water, and coal. The Haber-Bosch process thus had a dual effect on World War I. It enabled Germany to continue fighting despite the blockade, prolonging a war that might otherwise have ended relatively quickly. The nitrogen that fed populations in peacetime killed them in wartime. Haber's life-saving invention became a death-dealing weapon, not through malicious intent, but through the dual-use nature of chemical knowledge. But Haber wasn't satisfied with just providing explosives. He believed chemistry could provide a war-winning weapon. If Germany couldn't break through on the Western Front with conventional arms, perhaps chemical weapons could succeed. Haber became the leading advocate for using poison gas in warfare. His reasoning was both strategic and, he believed, humanitarian. Haber argued that gas weapons could end the stalemate of trench warfare quickly, forcing breakthroughs that would lead to rapid victory. A short, decisive war won through gas would ultimately kill fewer people than years of grinding attrition. The gas would be terrible, but war was terrible. At least gas might make it shorter. This logic, however reasonable it sounded, would prove catastrophically wrong. Gas weapons didn't shorten the war, they added a new dimension of horror without changing strategic realities, and the precedent of using chemical weapons would haunt the world for decades, creating weapons of terror that violated fundamental notions of civilized warfare. On April 22, 1915, at Ypres in Belgium, the German military implemented Haber's plan for the first large-scale poison gas attack. Fritz Haber was personally present, overseeing the operation. 6,000 cylinders containing 168 tons of chlorine gas had been positioned in the German trenches opposite French colonial troops. At 5 p.m., as the sun was setting, German soldiers opened the valves. A greenish-yellow cloud, heavier than air, drifted across no man's land toward the Allied trenches. French and Algerian soldiers watched in confusion as the strange cloud approached. Then it reached them. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system. It reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, essentially dissolving lung tissue from the inside. Victims coughed violently, gasped for air that wouldn't come, and drowned in the fluid filling their own lungs. The pain was excruciating. Soldiers clawed at their throats, tore off their uniforms, and ran in panic. Approximately 5,000 soldiers were killed in that first attack, with another 10,000 injured. The attack created a 4-mile gap in Allied lines. German troops, wearing primitive protective gear, advanced through the gap. But they hadn't prepared adequate reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. The gap was eventually closed and the front stabilized. The gas had created horror without decisive victory. Haber was there, watching his chemical weapon work exactly as predicted. He later claimed to feel pride in this accomplishment, viewing it as a German scientific triumph. He saw the gas as a humane weapon because it could be defended against with proper equipment, unlike bullets and shells. This rationalization reveals how Haber compartmentalized his thinking, focusing on the theoretical elegance of his solution while ignoring the reality of soldiers choking to death. Please take a moment to like this video if you're finding this examination of scientific ethics compelling. Your engagement helps us continue exploring these difficult questions about responsibility, progress, and the dual nature of knowledge. The Ypres attack opened Pandora's box. Both sides rapidly developed and deployed various poison gases, phosgene, mustard gas, and others. Gas masks became standard equipment. Chemical warfare became routine on the Western Front. By war's end, approximately 1.3 million casualties, including over 90,000 deaths, resulted from chemical weapons. Haber had indeed revolutionized warfare, but not in a way that shortened the war or reduced suffering. While Fritz Haber was at Ypres celebrating his gas attack, his wife Clara was in Berlin, increasingly disturbed by her husband's weapons work. Clara Haber, herself a trained chemist, understood exactly what Fritz was doing. She was horrified. The woman who had dedicated herself to using science for human betterment watched her husband use chemistry to kill. Clara pleaded with Fritz to stop his work on chemical weapons. She argued it was immoral, that it perverted science's purpose, that he was creating weapons of mass suffering. Fritz dismissed her concerns. He was serving Germany, using his scientific gifts for his country. He couldn't understand why Clara didn't see the patriotic necessity of his work. On May 2nd, 1915, 10 days after the Ypres Gasserkat attack, Fritz Haber returned to Berlin to celebrate his promotion to captain. There was a party at the Haber home to honor his achievement. Clara attended but was visibly distressed. After the party ended and guests departed, Clara and Fritz had a bitter argument about his gas work. In the early morning hours of May 2nd, 1915, Clara Haber took her husband's military pistol, went into the garden, and shot herself in the chest. She tells your young cousin, Hermann, who had been awakened by the gunshot. Clara Immerwahr Haber was 44 years old. Fritz Haber was devastated, but not deterred. He left the Eastern Front the next day to oversee new gas attacks against Russian forces. His son Hermann was left with relatives while Fritz continued his war work. The message was clear: nothing, not even his wife's suicide, would stop him from serving Germany through chemical warfare. Clara's suicide can be interpreted multiple ways. She was clinically depressed, struggling in a difficult marriage to a man who dominated her life and dismissed her career. She was also making a moral statement, choosing death over complicity with her husband's work. Her suicide note, if it existed, has never been found, but her actions spoke clearly. She couldn't live with what Fritz was doing. Fritz Haber never publicly acknowledged that Clara's suicide was related to his weapons work. He preferred to attribute it to her depression and mental instability. This denial allowed him to continue without confronting the moral questions Clara had raised. It was perhaps the clearest example of Haber's ability to compartmentalize, to separate his personal life from his patriotic duty. His love for him. When World War I ended in November 1918, Fritz Haber faced an uncertain future. He was on Allied lists of war criminals to be tried for violations of international law. The Hague Conventions had banned the use of poison gas in warfare, and Haber had not just used it, but pioneered it. He briefly considered suicide, went into hiding, and contemplated fleeing Germany, but prosecution never materialized. The Allies were more interested in punishing military and political leaders than scientists. The idea of trying scientists for weapons they developed was controversial. Where would such accountability end? Haber emerged from hiding and resumed his position as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry. Then came the Nobel Prize. In November 1918, the Swedish Academy awarded Haber the 1918 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his ammonia synthesis. The timing was catastrophic. The award came just after the war ended, while memories of gas warfare were fresh. Many scientists protested, arguing that honoring the father of chemical warfare was obscene. The ceremony was awkward, with several Nobel laureates boycotting. Haber defended himself by arguing that the Nobel Prize recognized his ammonia synthesis, not his weapons were. The two achievements were separate. He had solved world hunger. Wasn't that worth celebrating regardless of his wartime activities? The argument had merit, but felt morally evasive. The man receiving the Nobel Prize for feeding humanity was the same man who had gassed soldiers to death and celebrated it. The post-war period saw Haber continue his scientific work. He remained director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which became one of the world's leading chemistry research centers. He mentored young scientists, several of whom went on to distinguished careers. He worked on various problems, including attempting to extract gold from seawater to help Germany pay war reparations. The project failed. There wasn't enough gold and seawater to make it economically feasible, but Haber's reputation remained controversial. He was celebrated in Germany as a scientific hero who had enabled Germany to fight on despite the blockade. Internationally, he was viewed with suspicion and often hostility as the man who had introduced chemical warfare. The dual nature of his legacy was already apparent: savior and war criminal, depending on perspective. In the 1920s, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, under Haber's direction, developed a new pesticide. Zyklon A, later improved to Zyklon B, was a fumigant designed to kill insects and rodents. It released hydrogen cyanide gas, extremely effective at killing pests in buildings, ships, and storage facilities. The development was mundane. Commercial chemistry applied to pest control. Zyklon B was marketed widely and became standard for fumigation. Fritz Haber had no direct role in developing Zyklon B. The work was done by other chemists at his institute, but he was the director, and the research occurred under his oversight. Zyklon B was exactly the kind of practical applied chemistry that Haber encouraged, taking scientific knowledge and creating commercial products that solve real problems. Nobody in the 1920s imagined that Zyklon B would become one of history's most infamous substances. But in the 1940s, the Nazis would use Zyklon B in their extermination camps. The gas chambers at Auschwitz, Marstanic, and other death camps used Zyklon B to murder millions of Jews, Roma, and others. The connection to Fritz Haber, a Jewish-born chemist who had converted and served Germany fanatically, is one of history's most bitter ironies. Haber didn't live to see this perversion of his institute's work. He died in 1934, before the Holocaust began. But the connection haunts his legacy. The Jewish scientist who converted to serve Germany, whose institute developed the pesticide that Nazis used to kill Jews, represents the ultimate tragedy of assimilation's failure and the unforeseen consequences of chemical knowledge. It's important to note that Zyklon B was legitimately useful for pest control. The inventors weren't creating a murder weapon, they were solving practical fumigation problems. But like the Haber-Bosch process, which could produce either fertilizer or explosives, Zyklon B demonstrated how scientific knowledge can be turned to purposes its creators never intended. The dual-use nature of chemistry repeatedly appears in Haber's story, a reminder that knowledge itself is morally neutral only. Its application has moral dimension. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Fritz Haber was 64 years old, director of one of Germany's most prestigious scientific institutes, a Nobel laureate, and a national hero for his wartime service. He believed his contributions to Germany, his conversion to Christianity, and his distinguished career would protect him from Nazi racial policies. He was catastrophically wrong. The Nazis immediately began purging Jews from government positions, universities, and research institutes. The fact that Haber had converted to Christianity decades earlier meant nothing to Nazi racial ideology. He was Jewish by blood. therefore subhuman and unfit to hold a position of authority in German science. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed in April 1933, required dismissal of all civil servants of Jewish origin. Haber received a letter instructing him to dismiss all Jewish scientists at his institute. He was offered an exemption himself due to his pre-1914 appointment and war service, but his Jewish staff had to go. Haber was faced with an impossible choice: comply with Nazi racial laws and dismiss talented scientists because of their ancestry, or resign in protest. Before we continue with Haber's final years, please consider subscribing to our channel. These explorations of how scientific genius intersects with moral complexity help us understand the responsibilities that come with knowledge and power. In April 1933, Fritz Haber resigned as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, after serving Germany fanatically, converting his religion, developing weapons that killed thousands, and receiving the nation's highest honors. He was being told that his Jewish ancestry made him unfit to lead German science. The betrayal was complete. The country he had served so devotedly rejected him as unworthy. Haber was devastated. He had given everything to Germany. He had fought for German victory in the war. He had trained generations of German chemists. He had advanced German science to world leadership. And now Germany was throwing him away because his grandparents were Jewish. The assimilationist dream had failed absolutely. After resigning, Haber left Germany in August 1933. He wandered Europe, a man without a country, seeking refuge and purpose. Various institutions offered him positions. Cambridge University in England invited him as a guest researcher. But Haber was a broken man, his health failing, his spirit crushed by Germany's betrayal. Chaim Weizmann, a chemist who would later become the first president of Israel, offered Haber a position at the new Seif Research Institute. Later, the Weizmann Institute being established in Palestine. It was a generous offer, given Haber's conversion and his weapons work. Haber accepted, planning to spend his final years contributing to the Jewish homeland he had rejected in his youth. But Fritz Haber never reached Palestine. His heart was failing, and he stopped in Basel, Switzerland to rest and seek medical treatment. His health continued deteriorating. On January 29, 1934, Fritz Haber died of heart failure in a Basel hotel room. He was 65 years old. He died in exile, rejected by the country he had served so fanatically, estranged from the Jewish community he had abandoned, leaving a legacy so complicated that his funeral attracted only a handful of mourners. Albert Einstein, who had known Haber well, delivered a eulogy that captured the tragedy. Haber's life was the tragedy of the German Jew, the tragedy of unrequited love. Haber had loved Germany with passionate devotion, had given everything to serve his country, and Germany had rejected him as alien and unwanted. It was a pattern that would repeat across German Jewish history, but few cases were as stark as Haber's. How do we judge Fritz Haber? How do we weigh his contributions against his crimes? How do we balance the lives saved by synthetic nitrogen against the lives destroyed by chemical warfare? On one hand, Haber solved one of humanity's fundamental problems. The Haber-Bosch process made it possible to feed billions of people who would otherwise have starved. Every person alive today who wouldn't exist without synthetic fertilizer owes their existence partly to Haber's genius. The green revolution that prevented mass famine in the 20th century depended on nitrogen fertilizer from the Haber-Bosch process. Haber literally saved more lives than perhaps any other single person in human history. On the other hand, Haber pioneered chemical warfare, introducing weapons that caused immense suffering and established precedents for chemical and biological weapons that threaten humanity to this day. He personally oversaw gas attacks that killed thousands. He celebrated these attacks as German triumphs. He showed no remorse for the suffering his weapons caused. His work enabled Germany to prolong World War I, extending a catastrophic conflict that ultimately killed millions more than it would have if Germany had been forced to surrender when its Chilean nitrate supplies ran out. Some argue that judging historical figures by modern standards is unfair. Haber lived in an era of intense nationalism when serving one's country in wartime was viewed as the highest duty. Many scientists worked on weapons during World War I. Why single out Haber? The answer is that Haber didn't just work on weapons. He pioneered an entirely new category of warfare, one that violated existing international law and introduced suffering of a kind previously unknown. Others point out that Haber's weapons work was separate from his fertilizer work. The Nobel Prize recognized ammonia synthesis, which saved lives. Shouldn't we celebrate the life-saving achievement while condemning the weapons? But this separation feels artificial. The same process that produced fertilizer produced explosives. The same mind that solved world hunger innovated poison gas. Haber himself never separated these achievements. He took pride in both. The tragedy of Clara Haber adds another dimension. Her suicide was a moral protest. A chemist condemning chemistry's perversion into weapons of mass suffering, Fritz's response leaving immediately for more gas attacks, demonstrated his inability or unwillingness to confront the moral implications of his work. He compartmentalized brilliantly, keeping his scientific achievements separate from their human costs. The connection to Zyklon B, while indirect, adds final bitter irony. A Jewish scientist who converted to serve Germany, whose institute developed the pesticide that Nazis would use in genocide against Jews, embodies the ultimate failure of assimilation and the unforeseen consequences of scientific knowledge. Haber would have been horrified by Zyklon B's use in the Holocaust, but the connection exists regardless of his intentions. Fritz Haber's life illustrates science's fundamental dual-use problem. Scientific knowledge can be applied to help or harm. The same understanding of chemistry that feeds billions can kill millions. Nitrogen fixation produces both fertilizer and explosives. Pesticides can be turned to genocide. Science itself is morally neutral. Morality enters only in how knowledge is applied. This creates profound ethical challenges for scientists. Are they responsible for how their discoveries are used? Where does scientific freedom end and social responsibility begin? Should scientists refuse to work on dual-use technologies that might be weaponized? These questions, raised starkly by Haber's career, remain urgent today with artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and other powerful technologies that could benefit or harm humanity depending on application. Haber believed scientists should serve their countries in wartime. That patriotic duty required contributing their expertise to military victory. This view was common in his era and remains influential, but it led Haber to develop weapons that caused immense suffering and violated international law. The lesson might be that scientists need ethical frameworks beyond nationalism, principles that transcend national loyalty and consider humanity as a whole. The Haber-Bosch process demonstrates that scientific breakthroughs can have contradictory effects. Synthetic nitrogen enabled both feeding the world and prolonging destructive war. Technology rarely produces simple outcomes. Effects ripple in unexpected directions, creating benefits and harms that the inventor never imagined. This suggests humility should accompany scientific achievement, recognition that even brilliant innovations can have dark consequences. Haber's tragedy was also personal. His fanatical German patriotism, his conversion, his weapons work, none of it protected him from Nazi racial persecution. The Germany he served so devotedly rejected him as Jewish and unworthy. His story demonstrates the futility of trying to assimilate away one's identity to please those determined to hate you. Haber sacrificed his religious identity, his scientific ethics, and ultimately his wife's life in service to Germany, and Germany repaid him with exile and rejection. As we conclude this examination of Fritz Haber's complicated legacy, we're left with one of history's most morally ambiguous figures, a man who saved billions through his ammonia synthesis while killing thousands with chemical weapons. A Jewish scientist who converted to Christianity to serve Germany, only to be betrayed by Nazi racial laws. A husband whose weapons work drove his wife to suicide. A genius whose brilliance produced both miracles and nightmares. There's no simple judgment we can make about Fritz Haber. He wasn't purely good or purely evil. He was brilliantly talented, deeply flawed, and profoundly tragic. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about science, nationalism, and the dual nature of knowledge. It challenges simplistic narratives about progress and forces us to acknowledge that the same innovations that improve life can destroy it. Half the nitrogen in your body probably came from the Haber-Bosch process. You exist, at least partly, because of Fritz Haber's genius. But the same genius that enables your existence killed thousands with poison gas and provided explosives for industrial warfare. This dual legacy savior and killer defines Haber's place in history. The questions Haber's life raises remain urgent. How do we balance the benefits of scientific progress against its dangers? What responsibilities do scientists have for how their discoveries are used? Can nationalism justify developing weapons that violate international law and cause mass suffering? Should scientific achievement be celebrated when the scientist's other work was morally reprehensible? There are no easy answers, only the necessity of continuing to ask these questions. We study Fritz Haber not to celebrate or condemn him simply, but to understand how complicated human beings can be, how brilliance and moral blindness can coexist, how the same knowledge can save and destroy. His story warns against scientific work divorced from ethical consideration, against nationalism that overrides moral judgment, against the compartmentalization that allows people to do terrible things while viewing themselves as serving higher purposes. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of science's most complicated figures. These examinations of moral complexity help us understand that history rarely provides simple heroes and villains, only human beings making choices with consequences they often cannot foresee. Fritz Haber's choices saved billions and killed thousands, and we're still living with both legacies. Rest now, but remember these lessons. Question whether progress always leads where we hope. Consider the responsibilities that come with knowledge and power. Resist compartmentalization that separates action from consequences. Demand that science serve humanity broadly, not just national interests. Remember that our choices echo through history in ways we cannot predict or control. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. These explorations of science's dual nature and moral complexity help us navigate the ethical challenges of advancing knowledge. Your support helps us continue examining how human brilliance and human folly intertwine in shaping our world.